Bending Not Breaking, The Gifts of Imperfection Edition. Episode 5, Guidepost 3, Cultivating Resilience and Letting Go of Numbing and Powerlessness. Welcome back to Bending Not Breaking. This is your host, Ben Pruitt, and we are thankful that you have joined us and that you're listening in. We are just so excited to be diving into The Gifts of Imperfection, Brene Brown's book on guideposts to wholehearted living. And as we said, we are diving into our third guidepost, and we are excited because at the end of this mini-series, we are coming back to the Legend of Korra. And we are starting with book 2 of The Legend of Korra when we come back. And we have a series of wonderful guests lined up for that. And we are very excited. So get excited yourself because it's going to be great. This episode, though, we have a wonderful guest that I'm really excited about. And let me introduce Fran McMahon. And they are from the Best Damn Camp podcast, which is a Percy Jackson analysis pod. And she identifies as a queer writer, an editor, creator, freelancer, podcaster, also a YouTuber, kind of a big deal here. So let's give a warm welcome to Fran. How are you today? How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I've got to say, when you mentioned that, I have this whenever I've guested on things. I'm just like, well, I really do a lot of things, and it kind of surprises me how many things I do sometimes.
Yeah, there's a pretty long list there. That's like a lot of commitment.
Yeah, I thankfully I try to make time still for sleep because sleep is important, so that's still a priority.
We're gonna get to that. That's a episode later. Oh man, well that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. So we invited you to join us, and we've talked before offline, but can you just tell us just a little bit about your relationship with the Avatar universe? So that, because who's this Percy Jackson person coming on here to talk about Avatar? But what's your relationship with Avatar?
Yeah, no, of course. So, alongside obviously Percy Jackson podcast, my YouTube channel, I also do Avatar theory videos and various different things like that. I've taken a mini break from doing Avatar content, just there's a few things fandom related where I was like, you know what, I gotta take care of myself first because it's getting a little heated, people, so I'm gonna need to chill for a little bit. But besides all of that, I've basically been obsessed with Avatar since I randomly found an episode of it on this British channel called CITV, which was this children's entertainment channel. It was, I don't even remember what, I think it was one of the episodes, I think it was the drill episode.
Oh,
and I became obsessed with it because this one particular scene with Ty Lee that just cracked me and my sister up, where she sees the dust cloud that Toph has made and she's like, it's so poofy. Poof. And it just killed us. Just that moment of just poof. It literally just died hysterically laughing. And then every Saturday we were waking up to watch an episode of it. Never played in order. So I never actually saw Avatar The Last Airbender in order until probably 6 years after I'd watched it on CITV, around when I was watching Korra. So when Korra was airing, I was like, I know about Avatar, and I basically know the entire story, just very out of order.
Mm-hmm.
I should probably watch it in the correct order whilst I'm waiting for season 2 of Legend of Korra to air.
Okay.
So technically Legend of Korra came first, but I knew everything about Avatar beforehand, just not in the correct way. So I was watching random episodes from book 3, and then it'd go to book 1, and then it'd go back to book 3, and then book 2. It was chaotic, but still enjoyable.
What a fascinating way to kind of dive into the series, right? That's so interesting. I knew about it before I watched it, but I definitely started from episode 1 and just watched the whole thing chronologically. So that's interesting.
Yeah, it was definitely an interesting way to get involved in the series because I was confused at some parts, but that didn't matter at the end of the day because I was still entertained. And that's kind of the main thing about it, is as long as I was being entertained, I was happy, I was good.
Yeah.
And admittedly, some of the way in which the show works, you don't always have to kind of know everything like in sequence to understand it, except for, you know, some of the two-parters or the episodes that follow on from each other. So it worked out in the end, and eventually, of course, I did see the whole thing in proper order. Just took a little bit longer. I could have watched it sooner. It just didn't click with me at the time. I enjoyed it the way in which I'd watched it, that I didn't want to watch it the correct way.
Sure.
Until I was like, yeah, I should probably do it now because I'm watching Legend of Korra the correct way. So I should probably do it for the original series too.
Interesting. Well, that's so cool. And you said you do like theory videos. Did you have a theory, any one particular theory that you're like super passionate about?
Oh, so there's one that I absolutely adore. I didn't do very well on my channel, but like I love the video itself, and it was basically this analysis of Korra's character in book 2, because like everyone seems to hate Korra in book 2.
I know.
And I don't get it. Oh, well, I kind of do because sexism, but like but there was something about her character that really spoke to me. And it was after I did this whole like deep dive video into Korra's PTSD in the series and how it was explored. And it made me realise that book 2 Korra is in the denial stage of trauma. Like, she's basically forgetting everything that's happened with Amon. She's kind of going back to exactly how she was at the start, but somehow worse, but still has that trauma of how she felt in book 1 and all these sorts of situations going on with Amon. So she's less trusting, but she's still just as abrasive, and she doesn't trust people who are close to her because, you know, she was burned before with, you know, Tarlok. I always get confused. It's like, no, it's not Tonrock because that's her father, but there's lots of T's and rocks.
Yeah. Yeah, there sure are. That's funny.
But it was something that like I really enjoyed analysing about her character. Like, everything about Korra in book 2 was her going through the stage of denial through her trauma.
And I definitely think that people struggle with trauma response. And because when people are in trauma response, what happens is we aren't our best selves, right? We are literally struggling to like get back to this homeostasis where we are fully balanced within ourselves. And I think that's what makes so many people uncomfortable about season 2. And I don't think like people will always like attribute it. No, it was just a bad plot line, but it feels to me like it's way deeper than that. And I think you're speaking and putting your finger on that really well. Okay. Interesting. So that kind of is an interesting segue because it really made me think about what we're about to talk about in a way. And so, you know, I offered you all of the guideposts as kind of a choice to choose from, and you chose this one. Can you touch on like why did you choose this guidepost to choose?
Yeah, that's a good one. So I kind of wrote an answer on the document that we're looking at, and I realised I'm not happy with the answer that I originally put. Because actually, it's very, now that I'm thinking about it more, it's very different to what I initially wrote down. Although kind of the same, I guess. Like, I think the main thing about it, so I am definitely someone who personally struggles a lot with going into this sort of numbness and like feeling powerless sort of situation, like and not realising that I'm doing it. Like these last 3 weeks, I've like only discovered last week, even though it'd been going on for 2 weeks prior, that I was in a depressive state and had absolutely no idea about it. I was just like, you know, I'm just tired. That's all it is. Like, no, Fran. It's called depression. And I just had absolutely no idea because I was doing my usual thing of just working, do my full-time job, do my full-time podcasting, do my full-time YouTube, do my full-time freelance writing, do my full-time author writing, my full-time freelance editing, all these sort of things that I do. literally so many things to block out the fact that I was, you know, really unhappy. And it kind of like, it's one of those things that you go into your comfort sort of situations or finding things that make you happy in a sense to block out everything else. And it's something that I always examine about, because like Avatar and even Percy Jackson as well for my own podcast are things that are my comfort sort of like fictional media
Mm-hmm.
that also reflect exactly the same things that I go through myself, of avoiding the situation, leaning into things that are more enjoyable to help avoid the situations. And
Yeah.
I think that's kind of what led me to choose this one, especially for like the more positive side of it, of like cultivating this like resilience for, of being in a sense more positive and focusing more on the strengths of what you do in life, instead of focusing like fully on like failures and where you've gone wrong and feeling
Yeah.
less than, which is also something I see a lot in like the Avatar universe, but also is something I'm trying to cultivate in my own life as well, instead of just plowing myself with so much work that I'm just working and sleeping and doing nothing else.
Yeah. Wow, that really resonates with me too, because it sounds like one of the ways in which you kind of choose to numb is through work, right? And keeping busy. And that is absolutely my method as well. It's not the only method that I utilize, but that is definitely my number one numbing method is working and just constantly being busy. And it's a struggle for me because I intellectually understand that I am keeping myself busy, but I'm like, but I need to do all these things. And so it's like this weird battle of like, how do I let go? How do I let go of some of these things that I'm holding on to with my dear life? And I'm really excited to kind of dive into that with you as we talk about Avatar, right?
Yeah.
So just for everybody who's listening, we are covering some logistics. We are covering Guidepost 3, Cultivating Resilient Spirit, Letting Go of Numbing and Powerlessness. And that is in the Gift of Imperfection. It's pages 84 through 100 in the 10th anniversary edition. And then just as a signposting for next week, we'll be talking about Guidepost 4. You guessed it. And those are on pages 101 through 112. So just wanted to get some logistics out of the way before we really dive into what we're talking about today, which is, can we dive into like what do we need to let go of first before we touch on resilience? So if we touch on like, what is numbing? What is powerlessness? And then we'll kind of, dive into at the end, ending on a positive note, what we need to cultivate and work on. Maybe it's not so positive. We have to work on it. Anyway, it's a practice. We're gonna do it. We're gonna do our best. So, let's talk about numbing. What is numbing? And I guess let's talk about it from the way that Brene kind of introduces it, right? And she kind of gives us these three components, right? The first one is that most of us engage in numbing behaviors, right? Whether we are aware of it or not, we are engaging with it. And so there's also this idea that numbing is often conflated with addiction. And so addiction can be described as chronically or compulsively numbing to take the edge off. And it's interesting because addiction, and most of the time when you think of addiction, I don't necessarily associate it with numbing. But when it's put into this frame, all of a sudden I'm like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. And then finally, we cannot selectively numb, right? When we numb pain, we also numb the emotions that we desire. And so these are kind of three components. But when I kind of talk about numbing to you, Fran, I'm curious, what are the first things that come to mind in general when I say, like, what is numbing behavior for you? And not necessarily for you, but just that you think about numbing.
I guess the way I initially thought of it when I initially kind of chose this and also kind of started looking into it a bit more, my initial thinking for numbing was literally just finding something to like numb yourself. So like doing some, like, you know, when people say like you watch something mind numbing, so like trash TV and stuff like that, things that you really like, watching Riverdale for example, so things like that, things that are like just pure trash that you can just kind of wipe your mind of to get into it, so you can kind of take your mind off of other things because your mind is being so numbed by what is in front of you that you're not really focusing on anything else. But then obviously going into it a little bit more, it's like, okay, that kind of half is, but that's like the very small part of it. Like it's a lot bigger than just finding something just to kind of take your mind off of stuff. It's a little bit deeper than just that.
Yeah. And the examples that Brene offers are like a series of options that can numb. So like, probably the people that think of this from an addiction standpoint very quickly are like drugs or alcohol. But we can also numb with like all of these series of this whole list of like food, sex, relationships, money, work, caretaking, gambling, staying busy, affairs, chaos, shopping, cleaning, perfectionism, which we talked about last episode, constant change, the internet, Netflix, like all of these things that numb us, right? So I'm curious, before we kind of dive into any one of those in particular, I'd love to just ask the question, who numbs in the Avatar universe? And we're not going to be able to name everyone, but like, who are the first people that you think of when I say numbing, right?
The main two that definitely came to my mind, well, the first one was Korra, mainly just because I love Korra, so like everything Korra is just immediately on my mind in general.
Yeah.
But Korra herself was definitely one that came to my mind the most, predominantly based on book 1 and book 2. Because like in book 1, she's ashamed of her inability to be able to airbend and all these sort of things, so releases her frustration by focusing more on pro bending, training for pro bending, becoming friends with the pro benders that she was interested in, like Marco and Berlin, and building that friendship, all to take off the attention over her anxiety and frustration over not being successful at airbending. And it was an interesting thing, that kind of like noticing that, as well as the fact that like she skips her class, and even in book 4 as well, literally completely disappearing, like very literally removing herself entirely from the situation.
Yeah, bye humans.
Not face anything. yeah, goodbye humans. Emily, I can kind of understand it. People are kind of much sometimes, but I don't think I'd go as far as she did. But like, I can understand the.
Shoot, I could totally see myself doing it. Like,
yeah, like a good cabin in the woods, or not the horror kind, like the nice kind.
Yeah, Henry David Thoreau kind, right?
yeah.
But yeah, I'm interested that you brought up this idea of pro bending, because I think what's going to happen is we're going to lift up several moments for various examples, and I think we're going to hear a lot of people who could be like, I didn't see that as numbing at all, right? And one could argue that, her going into pro bending was, oh no, I think she saw that as like, this is a source of fun, so this was the way that she, let loose and got rid of the stress, but it wasn't numbing. She was still blah blah blah, right? And I think one of the things I'll just offer as kind of a caveat before we really kind of keep going and dive in is that I think there's beauty in the way that we kind of critique and analyze these things, because I think it can be both and, rather than it's not this, but it's only this. Do you see it that way too, or is that just me?
No, I can see that too. Like, there is definitely both ways that you can see of this situation. Like, I can definitely see where people would come from of like, no, it was something fun for her to do. It wasn't necessarily about numbing frustrations. It was something enjoyable. Clearly she had fun, and she found success with it as well. Like, obviously getting that airbending technique down. But, so I can completely understand. Like, there is two sides to every kind of analysis in a sense.
And the way that I heard it described by one of Brene's books, I don't remember if I read it in this chapter or not. You can only remember if I did. But one of the things that happens is if we're numbing with food, for instance, and for chocolate maybe, it's not necessarily numbing to enjoy that holy wafer of joy, right? And to put it in our mouths and eat that chocolate and savor it and love it and be like, wow, that was phenomenal, right?
Yeah.
Versus like eating that chocolate and not being mindful, and you're just eating it because you think that it will make you feel better. And I think that's kind of what separates, like, chocolate from being a helpful, healthy, wonderful thing to indulge in to something that is not necessarily serving us if we're not being mindful of what about it brings us joy. Does that make sense as an example?
Yeah, no, that does. Yeah. It's the sort of best of both worlds situation with those sort of things. Like you can have like sort of the moderation of
Yeah.
that sort of situation.
Yeah, and again, that's different for every person. Like I could eat a lot
Mm.
of chocolate and savor every bite, but as long as I'm savoring every bite, right? If I'm eating it and I'm not really processing what about it brings me joy, that's when it can be considered a numbing behavior, right?
Mm.
Because
Yeah,
if I'm
yeah,
eating it to avoid something else, right? Then
yeah,
it's
yeah.
not necessarily serving us in the way that it could be.
Mm.
So as we discuss all of these different scenes, I just want people to be mindful of what's your perspective, because our perspective isn't always the right one. It's just a perspective, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and so now we can dive into any one of these things we want, knowing that that's caveat, providing like, oh, anyone can interpret that differently. But yeah, I totally see the things you mentioned about Korra as definitely, especially the disappearing act, right? As like, I'm going
Mm.
to avoid all of these feelings and go disappear from people. And in a way, that's helping her process, but in a way, it's also a sense of avoidance as well. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
awesome. Did you have another moment? And you said, I think you mentioned two right off the bat. You talked about Korra. Another moment?
Yeah, so the other one, and this is one that technically I wrote last, but is one that I thought of first, but didn't know
Mm-hmm.
how to word it, so I wrote it last. And that is for Karuk in specifically the Shadow of Kyoshi
Spoiler
novel, where,
alert!
yeah, spoilers, um, where we learned that Karuk was basically fighting the spirits in the spirit world, and it was literally basically destroying his own spirit and very
Mm-hmm.
slowly killing him. And he could feel himself slowly dying. So to counteract that pain, he turned to drinking, to partying, to sleeping around with different women. I think he even mentions that he sleeps with different men because Rava is bisexual. Um, and um, and all of that was basically a sort of numbing process for the literal darkness and death engulfing him as he was fighting spirits and slowly dying in doing so.
Yeah, no, I was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I didn't think of that example. Because it's just like so spot on, because
Mm.
it's even described as I was just trying to take the paint. Oh my God, I can't speak. Take the edge off of the pain that he was
Mm.
experiencing, right?
Yeah.
And not only physically, but emotionally, right? Because he was also struggling with, again, spoiler alert, with, not being able to enjoy his love life the way that he had wanted, right? He
Yeah.
lost people that were special to him. He never really got to fall in love and engage with, Heiran. And so there's a whole lot of things that he's just trying to not feel, because all he wants to do is spend his final years, in less pain, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people judge him for that because they don't know the full story,
Mm.
which is a big yikes, right? And that kind of
Yeah.
speaks to a lot of things, I think, for us, right? Is we often are judging people based off of only what we can see, right? And to use the
Mm.
iceberg metaphor, like we're only seeing like the top little tip of the iceberg when there's so much underneath the water that we can't see, right? And this is just
Mm.
a really good example for Kuruk of that. Wow.
Yeah. No, definitely. I think what was interesting about that additionally is that, and this is I guess half kind of going off topic, but I feel like Karuk is like this imagery of like how toxic masculinity can literally be damaging at the same time, of him having to hide the very literal emotional pain and devastation that was being caused against him from every single person he cared about. He couldn't share his burden with anyone and just had to
Yeah.
keep it inside, so no one else was hurt and it was just him hurting instead. I
Yeah.
thought that was a really interesting sort of visual take on how hiding your emotions can literally kill you.
It's so interesting because the main shame trigger for
Mm.
men, this is not necessarily universal, but it is certainly the most common shame trigger for men, is do not be perceived as weak.
Mm.
And, you know, he chooses not to rely on his friends, right? And
Mm.
he chooses not to share the biggest burdens of his life with them in order to kind of not be perceived as weak. And instead it turned into this, you know, long standing perception of him as being not necessarily weak physically, but certainly weak of mind, right? And the people judging him based off of his like inability to, you know, handle the world. And I just wonder if his narrative would have been just completely different had he been willing to be vulnerable with his friends, you know?
Yeah.
Oof. All right. Well, we're certainly diving in deep, huh? So, okay. Well, you know, Kuruk's not the only one, and we certainly Korra as well, right? But I think there are also moments, especially in, like, we haven't talked about like Atla very much too, but so with Aang even, where there is a sense of numbing, and I think that again there are perceptions here where one could perceive Aang's adventures in the earlier seasons of like season 1, where he's like, oh, we should go do all of these fun things. We're going to go see the koi fish. We're going to go do this. We're going to go do that. And see that as avoidance behavior, right? Yeah. Where I'm like, I don't want to feel the hard things, so I'm going to go feel all the happy things and numb that negative feeling, right? But, you know, we've talked about it before on the podcast where, like, no, Aang's like valuing play, and Aang is utilizing these things that are helping him get through the hard things. So again, there's that balance of like, what is our perception and how do we dive in? And I think the answer is, how is Aang perceiving these moments? Is Aang doing this to avoid, or is Aang doing this to enjoy? Right? Because I think that's what separates it.
Yeah. I definitely feel like he's a sort of character where it's a little bit of both in the sense of his character. Like, he definitely has moments like he does, like, we see, I think it's the second episode, he mentions like he never wanted to be the Avatar. Yeah. Like, we know from the get-go that he doesn't want this. So there is this clear, and like I think it's literally the next episode. Or no, not the next episode, because that's the Gyatso. Although technically then, like, he goes to play airball when he gets to the temple. Like, he's instinctively like going towards fun. And then I think there's like an episode or two later they're doing the koi fish situation. Like, it's consistently like he sees something traumatic. The next episode, like almost immediately the next episode, they are then going on to a fun adventure. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like this sort of see something traumatic, pretend in a sense that it hasn't happened, and go and do something enjoyable so you can focus on that and numb the pain from that situation.
And I think what you're putting your finger on is that numbing is really complicated, because how we numb often serves us and serves the world really well. Yeah. And so for us, when we are using busy as our numbness, the things we're busy with are contributing to society. They're exercising our creativity. They are helping people who want to listen to the podcast and enjoy things. Like, when I stay busy with work and take on more projects, I am helping the people that I am serving through my work, right? And I think that, again, it is not that our numbing behavior, the behavior itself, is bad, right? Caregiving is a something that was on the list of things that, like, you can numb through caregiving? Yes, right? We can numb through things that are inherently good. And it is, again, how we approach those things and whether that is a crutch for us. And if we become addicted to it, then we are numbing the bad, but we're also numbing the good, right? And a really good example of that is Aang running away from Monk Gyatso, and then he numbs for 100 years in an iceberg, right? Oh yeah. He doesn't feel anything for 100 years, right? Yeah. He numbed the bad. Right? He didn't feel anything bad, but he also didn't feel anything good for 100 years. Right? Yeah. Like, it's hard because numbing is not great, but often we talk ourselves into the behaviors that we use to numb, right? And that's why numbing is so complicated. So, you've kind of dove into these. I always get stuck on that one. Your experience with numbing a little bit, but I'm curious. Can you elaborate just a little bit so that we can kind of put our fingers on some examples from real world?
I guess the most recent example I can think of is well, I've recently quit my job, and the anxiety of that, and like going into something like I'm going into being an author full time for the next year and a half.
Wow.
And I'm at this state where I'm like, I'm really excited about it, but the absolute terror and fear of like, have I made this terrible mistake, has snuck up on me, and I've not been aware of it, which has led to like this depressive state that I've been in, and this pure exhaustion of like the fact that, to cover up this fear that I'm very slowly feeling of like, have I made a mistake? Was this a bad idea? Am I actually good enough to do this full time and stuff like that?
Yeah.
Has led to me sleeping an average of 4 hours a day, because I'm getting up to work sooner, to work later on writing, to work later on editorial services for other people, to create more content for YouTube, to get ahead of my podcasting. Like, I recorded 4 months in advance for my current podcast, so I could get ahead and keep recording episodes so there'd be more content for other people.
Wow.
And just kept
going
and going.
4 months ahead.
Honestly, it was both like a good idea, but like I put so much on like my weekends. I had no time for rest. I was waking up at 7-8 o'clock on weekends. I hadn't had a lie-in. First time I had a lie-in was when I got my second COVID jab, and I slept for 14 hours after getting the day after, and I hated myself for being asleep for such a long period of time, because I was like, I should have been doing this, I should have been doing that, I should have been, etc., etc., all these things that I should be doing. And when my mum told me, you can have a break, I responded with, I can't though, because I have to prove to myself that what I'm doing is the right decision.
Yeah.
And it was saying that made me realise I've been basically forcing myself to keep working on all these creative things to convince myself that, I haven't made a terrible mistake, that like, look, I am competent, I can do this as like a full-time situation. That I was basically working 6 full-time jobs for the last month and a half.
Yeah.
And was not aware of it at all. Or to kind of numb out this fear and anxiety of leaving a full-time paying job to go into a creative industry that isn't a guarantee.
Yeah.
And had basically a big break. Not a good thing, obviously, to get to that point where you kind of, the Coke bottle analogy of like, everything is just building up until it kind of pops.
Yep.
But thankfully I was aware of it just before a possible pop, and basically have done nothing all this week. Done no writing except for yesterday. Haven't done any YouTube content because I'd recorded all my podcast stuff in advance. Haven't done any podcast recording. Like, I'm taking that time to just rest for the next 2 weeks, other than obviously doing my current job that I'm still having to do on weekdays. But even then, people at work have been helping me with a few things here and there, because I've said, I may need a little bit of help, thank you.
Yeah.
But that was a big thing of just literally a very recent numbing experience that I was just not aware of for a very long period of time.
Yeah. Wow. It's such a poignant example, because I find that we are so unaware of when we're doing it often, right? And I think part of what we'll learn today, and we'll get to it at the end, like the things we have to let go of, but also the things we need to start doing in order to cultivate resilience, is this idea of reality checking, right? And it's like, oh, I do need rest, right? And it's like letting ourselves like grapple with the fact that we are finite bodies that need to respect the boundaries of those bodies, right? But yeah, I think thank you for sharing that with us and helping us kind of see a real life example because it's hard and we're all kind of grappling with this, right? And I think one of the things I appreciate about this chapter is Brene offers us some questions to ask of ourselves, to kind of understand, is this numbing, right? And so whatever our behavior is, you can ask this question. Does our blank behavior get in the way of our authenticity? That's the first. The second is, does it stop us from being really honest and setting boundaries and feeling like we are enough? And then the third question is, does it keep us from staying out of judgment and from feeling connected? And then lastly, are we using this behavior to hide or to escape from the reality of our lives? And so these are the questions that are kind of offered for us if we are curious whether our behavior is numbing or beneficial in helping us. We can kind of ask these questions. And again, I think the answer can be both. It can be helpful and it can take us out of our authenticity. It can be helpful and it can put us into judgment, right? And so again, sometimes it requires that we just ask ourselves these questions to kind of like get started, and then we might need to go see a therapist to help us finalize. Again, advocating for our personal mental and emotional health. So, yeehaw. Okay, I'm ready to move on to powerlessness. Are you ready to kind of dive into powerlessness?
Yeah, I'm good to go.
We are feeling the powerful enough to move on. So again, powerlessness is kind of described as the inability to affect change, right? To put it into the simplest terms. And so I'm curious about times where we've kind of talked about numbing now. Do you have a time where you have experienced powerlessness?
I guess in states of like when I have a panic attack and like that momentary of like this fear of I had one quite recently. No idea where it came from. There was nothing that happened that day that would lead to it. It was just a very sudden onset panic attack where I wasn't able to like properly feel like I could breathe for about half an hour, and had to call my mother, who was downstairs cleaning in the living room, from my phone. She heard like the anxiety attack happening over the phone, came up and basically had to hold me whilst I was going through it. And it was the most terrifying thing, because I'm the sort of person that I don't like relying on other people, because I feel like it's one of those things, just like this immediate fear of like, if I rely on someone else, if I end up alone, what do I do then? It was an awful experience of just not knowing how to get out of this panic attack, trying to use all these things that I've been taught in the various years of therapy that I've been in, finding none of them of use at all, and then ending up having to rely on someone else. It was just the most powerless I've ever felt in like the most recent period of time, but there's been many throughout the years, because being a woman, being gay, there's a lot of crap out there that can lead to further things, but that's the most recent one.
Wow. And I'm hearing from you that sense of powerlessness kind of emerged from this, and please correct me if I'm wrong or if I'm reaching, but I'm hearing this sense of there was nothing I could do and I had to rely on others, and in a sense, like I don't see a way out of this, and so in a way that stemmed from like a lack of hope, right? A lack of hope. There was no hope for being able to get out of this, and so I felt powerless. Am I reaching there? How does that resonate with you?
That does sound about right. Like there was especially a lack of like hope in me being able to do it myself. Like initially, like I didn't call my mother. Like I messaged a bunch of friends on like Discord servers saying, send me gifs of kittens and dogs, just something to distract me. And I hated doing that. Firstly, that was like 5-10 minutes in. I was like, okay, nothing's working. maybe seeing some cats will work. And it just like it kind of continued from there. So there was this hope of, if I can't help myself, maybe they can, and when they couldn't, having to rely on someone more physically there, was this like hopelessness of, I can't do this myself, and the fear of not being able to do that, like this basic thing that in my mind, and I guess most people's minds, of like, you should be able to help yourself. Like, you should be able to get yourself out of these situations if necessary, because it's very much like the way in which the world kind of works. It tells you that, you know, you need to be individual. You need to be an individual. You've got to be able to work things out yourself. You can't always rely on people.
It's interesting because that's a very Western thought.
Yes.
Like, I think, therefore I am, in the Descartes realm, and it's me and the individual and the self, and we're individually focused. Whereas, like, when you go east, like, instead, like, there's an African proverb that's, I am because we are, right? There's a sense of connectedness and community, and it's completely different. It's very relational. Like, the self is relational before it is individual, rather than in the Western world, it's like me, 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 me. And this drive and need to be independent. And that just doesn't exist in the same way in other cultures. And I think that it's more prone to feelings of powerlessness because we are so much less likely to ask for help because of this need for independence. We're so much less likely to show weakness, because if I show weakness, it's a form of me being unable to help myself, and that's shaming, right? There's so many things that are tied to it. And as I kind of say these things, how does that resonate with you? What are you thinking about as I say those things?
Like, it makes sense to me. Like, I know this is something that like this God, I'm just thinking of the film, I think it's called The Farewell, like that Awkwafina film, where like her and her family, who are living in America, travel back to China because her grandmother has cancer and is supposedly dying, but they don't tell her because it's the responsibility of the family to carry that burden, because the hope is, and the belief is, that if they don't know that something is killing them, that maybe it won't kill them too quickly. Like, the not knowing will save them and keep them alive longer. And it was like a really interesting way of thinking about things. Like, that definitely wouldn't happen here. Like, it's like that wouldn't even be a consideration here of family keeping that burden for themselves and allowing whoever is unwell to live a fuller life of being happier until the last moments. Like, that would be considered like, basically not I was gonna say blasphemous, that's not the right word. It'd be considered almost like, it's not the right word, but like, quote unquote, unkind and cruel to do so, of keeping that from a family member, whereas really it's the kinder thing to do is to allow them to be happy for as long as they can be, and just keeping that burden yourself, so you're carrying it for them.
And I mean, there's a lot of people that would very much debate that, right? And it's interesting because, ultimately what is kind is, I think, dependent upon the person that we are engaging with, right? What is more kind, to withhold this thing or to share it with them so that they can process it? Or what is more kind? Like, there's a lot of different schools of thought on that. So it's pretty fascinating to consider, like, that. And I think that's one of the things why, we have to always be constantly aware of context, right? And our specificities and our particularities and our experiences drastically affect how we engage and process the world. And we have to be mindful that other people process things differently, right? And that's in any one way of doing things is like laughable to think that there's only one way. So yeah, I'm grateful that you're lifting that up, because it's kind of pointing us towards that. So we've kind of talked about a little bit of powerlessness in our lives. Now I kind of want to bring it into the Avatar verse, right? So what moments for you come to mind when the idea of powerlessness comes up in the Avatar verse?
I was going to bring up another Korra moment, but I feel like I talk about Korra a lot, so I'll
I
bring
love
up. I think I'll mention one from the Kyoshi books, and it's particularly this one quote from Yang. I think it's Yang Chen that it comes from. Is you must give up your desire for someone to tell you your choices were correct in the end. And it's this moment where like Kyoshi is basically seemingly convinced that like there is no positive change that she can make. Like she's sort of in a sense, and this is the thing that I love about it, like the Kyoshi books made the Korra series so much better in my opinion, because they're quite similar in how they're treated in their stories and how they're treated by like the society in that series as well. Like Kyoshi has to put on this image of basically being what she's considered to be in the Avatar fandom, the people who haven't read the books, of being a stone cold murderer, someone who will kill on sight, whereas that is not the kind of person she is. She doesn't want to be that person. It is a facade. And she questions every decision that she makes. She's never sure if she's making the right one.
Yeah.
And like spoilers for Shadow of Kyoshi, for example, she believes that Yun can change and that he's just being, in a sense, manipulated by the spirit. He's controlled by the spirit. But of course she turns out to be wrong, and she nearly loses everyone that she cares about because she trusted in someone that she once knew. And I think it's like a huge moment for her where like this hopelessness and this powerlessness, where someone who is incredibly powerful like Yun comes and shows her that she isn't as good as she believes, and that, you know, she's failed, she is a failure, she doesn't deserve to be the Avatar, she should have been the Avatar, all these sort of things. And this moment with Yang Chen saying, you know, you have to give up this desire for someone to tell you that you are correct, because you're never going to get that. As long as you believe that you yourself are correct and that you have made the right decision for you, that is the most important thing.
That's so, like, I'm getting chills because that speaks to so many different things around all of the guideposts in general, where like when I find that whenever I'm seeking external validation, I usually know the right answer. I just don't want to either trust my instinct, or I am like, and it's often I'm seeking external validation for my own personal choices. Like, oh, should I pursue a music singing career, or should I go work at the YMCA and do summer camp work? Should I, like, and I'm like, oh, somebody should tell me the answer. And what every time I asked someone, I would get really beautiful feedback, and it wouldn't make it any easier. The answer was never made easier with these really difficult questions, because it was ultimately something that I had to lean into and answer myself. Right? And so when Yang Chen says this, it's like, oof, that sucks. Because what it's saying is that we have to cultivate this idea that we have to let go of this idea that there's someone that has the answers, right? Because you know, in the world of Avatar, it's like, oh, I can ask all these previous avatars, and they're heralded as the greatest of their time, and they have all the answers, when really they're just human beings that, you know, have a few extra bending abilities, and they're fallible, and they don't have the answers, and like no one source is, you know, God in which we can get all of the answers. And to believe otherwise is to believe that, you know, people are godly in a way. Which is, putting people on that kind of a pedestal is really dangerous.
Definitely.
Ugh. So a moment for me that comes up when I think of powerlessness is, you know, and I asked the question on Twitter, and this was the first one that came up, and I was like, yep, that's definitely some powerlessness, is when the gang loses Appa in Atla. And so, you know, they're, you know, doing their best to get the information they need from Wan Shitong in the library. And Toph is holding up a giant city for a library by one tower's worth of earthbending. And what happens is Aang gets out and Toph has been hurt and Appa is gone, and Aang just is like, oh no, because what he has is this ample amount of power, right? He has the ability to enact change and affect change immensely because of his prodigious skill. But in this moment, this is a moment where we see that he is powerless because there's nothing that he can do. And for that whole episode, the whole next episode, we see him grapple with that powerlessness where he gets angry. He starts like, no, I can do this. And he's going to go and do things. And he eventually comes to terms with like, no, there's nothing I can do. And it stems from like, oh, I have power. I have hope. I can do this. I can save Appa. Then he goes and looks for him, can't find him. Oh, hope diminished. Then he's like, no, I can do this. Hope diminished. Oh, there's Appa. Just kidding. It's a cloud. Hope diminished. And as this hope reduces and reduces and reduces, the powerlessness scales up every time he loses more hope, right? And so I think it's really important to kind of highlight this relationship between our perceived understanding of whether we can make change and our understanding of what hope is and how hope works. Does that make sense? Am I just talking?
No, you make sense. Yeah. And that, in terms of what happened in the episode as well, it makes sense that like the more he's losing hope, the more powerless he starts to feel, which leads to that final confrontation, obviously at the end of the episode, where it's like the, again, like I mentioned, like the Coke bottle situation. Like, his hopelessness has been dropping, his powerlessness has been rising, and it all just comes to a head the moment where he can use his powers because of all this rage and anger and hopelessness that has just been building, and he just lets loose because there's nothing else he can do.
Well, and I think that there are like 3 phrases that come to mind that are like forms of powerlessness that people say. One is, oh, it's all my fault. It's my fault. I did it and I can't change anything. It's all my fault and there's nothing I can do, right? And so like, it's all my fault. Then the second one is, it's all their fault, right? There's nothing I can do because like they did it. It's their fault. And so when we blame, right, all of a sudden that is a form of powerlessness. We are shifting the culpability, responsibility, accountability onto someone else, right?
Yeah.
And then the next one is it's out of my hands. There's nothing I can do about it. Where it's like, it's not anybody's particular fault, but it's like, I'm so outside and removed from the situation that there's like, oh, there's nothing I can do. I'm so sorry. It's like the random, retail employee being like, oh, it's, corporate's decision. It's out of my hands. There's nothing I can do. Right.
Yeah.
And those are kind of like 3 like taglines for powerlessness in my mind. Are there any moments for you that arise, and I guess this might be one of our last examples for powerlessness, but are there any of those that kind of stick out for you from the Avatar verse? And if not that, just another moment of powerlessness?
Korra definitely has a lot. I feel like when you said it's all my fault, it's like, I swear I've heard Korra say that at some point in the show, or at least something to that effect, because like that was the big thing about Korra, and also like her not saying it, but people saying it's all her fault, like people
blaming Korra like all day long, right?
And that's not even on the show, that's just the fandom. On the show it's just as bad. So it's both on the show and in the fandom that Korra is getting all of the blame for all the situations. Like, she's blamed for the loss of the past lives. Literally not her fault.
Yep.
If anything, if you want to blame someone that isn't the villain, because apparently people don't like to blame villains, you can technically blame Bolin and Mako. They had one job, keep the twins out. They couldn't manage it.
Nope.
And them getting in is the reason why Korra was distracted, because she was then getting hit on all sides.
No, it's Korra's fault. She's the Avatar. She should be able to deal with it.
Yeah. And it's things like that where I'm just like, but you're missing the main context of that situation of what led up to it.
It's also what I'm perceiving to be, and I'm just now coming to terms with this, like people are giving Korra a competency tax where because she's the Avatar and because she has more skill, she is being taxed at a higher rate, right? And it's it's the same premise as when, someone who is, better at their job does they get more work assigned to them because they're better at it than the people who aren't as good. So rather than holding accountable the people who aren't good at their job and making them like come up to standard, instead we're taxing the people who are good by making it harder for them because they're good at it. In the same way, it feels like we're doing that with our criticism and judgments of Korra, right? She's incredibly competent and capable, and because of it, we are judging her way harder.
Yeah. And I know Mike and Brian have talked about that. Like, they were surprised at how much the fans didn't let Korra get away with making mistakes in comparison to Aang. Like, I think someone made a tally, but they made a tally of the mistakes that each of, like, both Korra and Aang made that led to problems. And Aang made more mistakes in his series than Korra did.
Yep.
But most of those mistakes aren't given the same level of attention as the mistakes that Korra's made. And it's kind of crazy. But there's lots of situations like that of like her saying, there's nothing I can do, people saying it's all her fault, and even her in some sense saying it's all my fault.
And it's the same thing,
saying those exact words.
It's the same thing with like the spirit portal as well. Like, and it was in the comics when people are like, President Raiko won, but also some of the spirits were like, no, it's your fault this is happening, and like there's no accountability. So again, I think one of the questions that is emerging for me from this conversation is that when we find ourselves blaming, whether we're blaming ourselves or we're blaming someone else directly, or we're blaming like the powers that be that are, quote, beyond our control, then what we're doing is we're shifting the blame and we're accepting this idea that we have no ability to enact change, and we are saying I'm powerless, right?
Yeah.
And we have to begin to let go of that. And so what I want to do now is kind of dive into how do we do that, right?
Yeah. And
the way that Brene kind of gives us, the way she offers us a chance to do that is to cultivate this idea of resilience. And so I kind of want to go into these 5 factors of resilience that she lists, and then kind of see what you have to offer and see if there's any moments that speak to us in terms of characters that do this well. So these 5 factors. 1, people who have resilience have these in common. They are resourceful and have good problem-solving skills. So they're able to solve problems. They're able to use their resources. 2, they're more likely to ask for help, right? They're not, and that's directly speaking to what we were talking about earlier, right? They are more likely to hold the belief that they can do something that will help manage their feelings and cope. So they have this emotional awareness, right? 4, they have social support. So again, not that individual mindset, but that relational mindset of people that are in their corner that are helping supporting them. And then 5, again, leaning on the same thing, they're connected with others, such as friends and family. So after hearing these things, and you read the chapter as well, but how does that make you feel? Because it makes me feel like I hear those things, I'm like, oh crap. Because I'm like, oh no, I have all these things that I don't do really well. But what are your thoughts as you hear these?
Yeah, when I was reading these, I was like, I think I do one of these things. and I don't always do it. So it's an infrequent use of, in this case, number 2, so more likely to seek help. Like, I seek therapy whenever when I know that I need it. But there are times where, like, I wait a little bit longer. It's like, oh, I'll just wait and see. And then it's like, well, that was a terrible decision, Fran. The moment you thought I should probably go to therapy, you should have called and tried to set up to go to therapy instead of like, we'll wait 2 months, see what happens. Like, no. you don't put a pause on when you should go see a therapist if you're in that mindset of, I should probably be seeing a therapist.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's the only one that I kind of occasionally do. But yeah, I was definitely that. So, oh, for God's sake, I don't do many of these, and that is not a good sign. I think it's definitely one of those things. I feel like, especially like for our generation, like we like pick and choose between these. Like we don't keep consistently one or all of them. Like we have one, we won't keep up with it. We'll have another one, won't keep up with that. Have another. Like we go between them all, but never all at once.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting.
Like, yeah. Like, for example, some people have a lot of social support for a long period of time. Like, whilst I was, like, people at uni, you build, like, this really close bond because you're with each other all the time. Once you leave uni, that breaks away almost immediately because you're from different areas usually. Seeking help, kind of easy to do depending on where you are as well. Like, obviously in the US, therapy can cost, so it's not always something that is available to every person.
Yeah.
In the UK, mental health services are more available, but the waiting lists are really long, so it's not something that's as immediate. So you then are just kind of waiting for that, which means you aren't continuing to seek help through other ways. You're then just kind of waiting for that to happen later on.
Yeah.
I think it's just a thing that a lot of people do now, just because it's like that whole thing of like oh god, what's the phrase? Something, the grind or the hustle. Oh, the hustle culture. That's it.
Yep.
Of like just working so much and kind of doing as many things as possible, because that's kind of the only way to live in this current society.
Yeah.
Which leads to a lack of these like factors of how to be like healthier and in a sense better as a person for yourself and for others, because there's no real way to do it with ease.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I mean, again, I think of Korra when we talk about this, but specifically, I think of the difference between season 1 Korra and season 4 Korra. And, you know, Korra went through a lot, like capital A lot. And, I think that she learned a lot too because of that. And I think that season 4 Korra is way more likely to lean on her support system. I think season 4 Korra is way more likely to ask for help. I think season 4 Korra is more connected to others, to family, to friends, right? Korra is more emotionally aware, right? And so all of these things are contributing and stemming from her learning. And what I am not suggesting is that we all have to have this life-changing trauma event, or rather series of trauma events, in order to cultivate these things. But what I am saying is that she was put into a crucible of having to learn these things in order to survive, in order to thrive later on. She had to go through these, and that's really scary, because I don't want people to believe that they have to have these terrifying things happen to them in order to achieve resilience, right? In order to be resilient, you do not have to, resil. You don't have to go through these things in order to practice what will make you resilient. So with that in mind, if those are the most common factors, I kind of want to ask that, or kind of dive into the 3 things. These are the 3 practices that Brene Brown suggests in order to cultivate resilience. And this will kind of be our close to the end of our conversation. But the patterns of resilience, right, that we want to start practicing, and so that we can build this as a skill, right, in order to cultivate it. The first one is, we've been dancing around this the whole time, is cultivating hope, right? Yeah. Because if powerlessness and hopelessness are conflated with one another, then we need to be able to practice hope in order to cultivate this idea of I have power to enact change. So when I say that, what do you think of? What are ways, or what are characters that do hope really well that we can learn from?
I think for me, and this may be one that surprises people because people don't think much of his character as a whole in the series, that would be Bolin for me in Legend of Korra.
Okay, tell me more.
So the reasoning behind it is that Bolin for me is like the glue, the
Mm,
glue of the group of the new team Avatar in Legend of Korra. He's the one who helps basically helps Korra feel more confident in herself. Like that moment where obviously that whole love triangle situation, really messy, really awful, but he was still kind to her at the end, saying, you're still a great person. Like you're still awesome. Like
yeah,
you're Korra. And he continues to be like that throughout. He does the same thing with Mako when Mako is about to make that sacrifice at the end of the series. Like, you don't need to prove how awesome you are. I know you're awesome.
yeah,
And basically and even going with Asami to like the Varric ship, like him being that supporting presence for her. He is someone who is continuously hopeful and caring of others, that he helps instill a sense of hope into them whilst also having it himself, because he's one person who I think is very hopeful as a person. Like he
yeah,
joins Kuvira because he thinks Kuvira is making change and being someone who's bringing a new sense of hope to the Earth
yeah.
Kingdom. Obviously misguided, but his heart was in the right place. Like he was seeing the good they were doing and was helping with it by instilling this new hope in the people who had lost so much.
I would say another fairly concrete example of hope being tied to power is this moment where Bolin realizes that he's a lava bender, right?
Yeah,
He
yeah, yeah.
is cornered. He is like, he could go into hopeless mode and be like, there's nothing I can do. But instead, he's like, I'm going to step in front of this wall of lava and see what I can do. Now that's a very like high risk situation. And like,
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah.
saying that we should all like, oh, let's, step in front of lava. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that Bolin does it, and it shows that his hope reveals his power,
Mm.
right? And so
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
think that's just a really good example that I thought of as you were speaking.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example as well. It definitely shows like he was willing to risk it all as well, out of hope that something would happen, so he could save the people that he cares about.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. Okay. And I think another like obvious hopeful person is Katara. And I think about like Katara is like always being like, oh, but look what we can do together. And there are so many speeches of hers that kind of speak to that. So,
Yeah.
that's just a low hanging fruit when it comes to hope. Okay. The second thing that we want to practice is critical awareness is the term that Brene uses. And critical awareness, again, for those of you who didn't necessarily read the chapter, is like reality checking, being mindful about the realities of the world and
Mm.
checking our stories with with reality, right? And so, for instance, if I'm saying like, uh, I think about beauty standards is the most common thing to reality check. Like reality
Mm.
checking like the magazine covers and the people in film and being like, that's not what normal people look like. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's one way we can practice critical awareness. But I'm curious, Fran, for you, when you think about who does this, and again, in the Avatar verse, is anyone come to mind that you can think of that, is really good at reality checking the situation?
I think for me that may actually. So I initially wrote down Korra, but I think actually the main person I can think of is Rangi from the Kyoshi novels. Like I feel like
Ooh.
she's someone who grounds a lot of the reality that's going on, but also brings Kyoshi back to reality of like the importance of certain things. Like there is this moment that I don't know if many people consider this to be like a reality checking moment, but it's one that I personally kind of do, in the sense that it feels important, like it's clearly important for the reason you're doing it, and that's Kyoshi having to learn the elements in the correct order that she is meant to. Because
Yeah.
there is a scene where she started learning waterbending, but she wasn't meant to be learning waterbending at this point. She was meant to be learning airbending before she even attempted waterbending. And Rangi basically took it upon herself to show her airbending techniques that she had learnt at the academy, which was a very interesting hint for how the Fire Nation were able to,
Yeah.
do what they did. Of like, they literally analysed every single nation and how they fought and what they did. But she taught Kyoshi, in a sense, how to use airbending moves, because the reality of the situation was that even though it is a traditional thing to follow it in the order, there is a reason for it. And it's similar to like how Aang learnt fire before he learnt earth, and obviously that went terribly wrong.
Didn't go great, yeah.
And I feel like that's a sign of like you should learn it in the correct order, because there is a reason for it. And I don't necessarily, admittedly personally, I do believe that there is a sort of like a curse, not like a curse, but there is a consequence for not doing it the correct way. Like there is a reason why you are learning it in this order, and it's because that is the way in which it should be done. But as a whole, I feel like Rangi is the person who grounds Kyoshi's story. Like she brings to reality, like, you know, morality is important, having morals is important. She tries to convince, like, she's the person who keeps Kyoshi on the side of morality and not becoming a killer because she could. It's very much that sort of last resort situation, and that was brought to her by Rangi of death is only a last resort, it should never be a first thought. I think that's a really interesting thing about Rangi's character. She's like a short ball of like anger and rage, but she's very, very realistic in how she thinks about the world.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. That's a great example. So the next one is the easiest one for sure, which is letting go of numbing and taking the edge off vulnerability, discomfort, and pain. And I wish it were as simple as saying, "Oh, I'm just going to let go now. I'm just going to stop numbing, and that'll be it." Right? But that doesn't work well, right? We can't just like selectively be like, "Oh, I'm done." Like some of us have the capacity to do that, but like, man, I do not. Which is why I think the term cultivate is used, like cultivating resilience, rather than saying like be resilient. Here are the 5 ways to be resilient. Like there's a reason it's not written that way. We have to cultivate it. We have to build it up. We have to practice it so that we can become more rather than just do, right? It's not something that's like we are either doing it or not doing it. It's something that we are like slowly bringing it in and weaving it into our lives to where it's more present, right? So again, if we kind of circle back to this idea of these 3 things, cultivating hope, practicating critical awareness, and then letting go of numbing, what I'd like to do is like, let's talk about like how to actually cultivate those things. And I want to do that. And, just for time frame references, probably like, let's give ourselves 10 minutes to dive into that before we dive into our ending segments.
All right.
Does that sound okay with you?
Yeah, that works for me.
All right. So let's dive into like hope, and like what are the practices and things that we can do in order to start building more hope into our lives so we can be more resilient. So, you know, Brene gives us some examples, right? And I kind of want to dive in and see what we can learn from the Avatar verse from these people. So the first one is setting realistic goals. So like, I'm curious for you, there's a lot of like goal setting, I think, that happens in the Avatar verse, but I'm curious what moments of that comes up for you.
The one that was kind of like a secondary thought that kind of became more of a big thought for me was the moment where Zuko confronts his father during like the Day of Black Sun.
Oh, okay.
Because I feel like it was clearly a moment that was like, it was leading up to that moment that he needed to confront his father. Like it was a goal for him to basically tell Ozai, you know, this is what you have done to me. You have lied to me. Our country has lied to me and to our entire people. And basically get all of this that he's clearly been building up since he was a child off his chest for him to be able to leave without having any regrets about not saying anything.
Yeah. So Zuko set a goal of, I need to have a conversation with Ozai, right? Yeah. Okay. So I think that's important, and I think that'll play well into the next part of what hope is, right? 1, hope happens when we can set realistic goals. 2, when we are able to figure out how to achieve those goals, so including the ability to be flexible when something happens, right? To develop alternative routes. So that kind of, again, that problem solving skill that was described earlier. And so that kind of plays well within your example, with the Day of Black Sun, right? Because like, Ozai's a bender that's like got some, he's pretty powerful. He's considered the most powerful firebending master of his time. And it's one of those things where Zuko's not. Like he's certainly talented, but he's not the most powerful firebender. So it seems like, how do I confront Ozai in a way that's not going to give me another scar? And this Day of Black Sun is like showing his like, innovation and ability to like, oh, this is the moment when I can do this. Right. And so that kind of gave him this capacity to have that conversation. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I agree. I think it also shows the side of like this intelligence that Zuko has, that like, if I want to have this, because I need to have this conversation with my father, I need to do it in a way that I will be safe.
Yeah.
And making sure it's on the Day of Black Sun where neither of us have the ability, and he has his sword as well, just in case. Like he has like an additional backup in case something further happens. But it was a smart decision. Like he has this alternate route of literally no firebending, weapons as a further backup, and then also being prepared for when the time came. Like obviously when Ozai did then lightning bend at him, he was prepared for that also. So he had so many things like this sort of thing of like staying flexible and developing these alternate routes. He had all of that ready, just in case, and was prepared for each of those moments.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so those are the first two. Hope, it happens when we have the ability to set realistic goals, when we can figure out how to achieve those realistic goals, including being flexible and developing alternative routes when obstacles appear. And then 3, believing in ourselves, right? We have to believe in ourselves, and we have to be able to, like, in a way, when we set that goal and we figure out how to achieve it, we have to believe that we can achieve it. And that's something that's it seems pretty nuanced to me, to be able to be like, oh, I believe in myself, right? Because that in and of itself feels like paradoxically like hope, right? And so one of the things that I really love, one of my favorite quotes, is that hope is a function of struggle, right? Hope occurs and is cultivated and builds when we are able to successfully navigate struggle, right? And I think it's important to understand that hope it happens in the context of other people, right? And that's something that Brene kind of points to, is that in order to cultivate hope, we have to be in relationship with other people. We learn hopefulness. And in that sense, it suggests that we need relationships, right? And we need relationships that have boundaries. We need consistency. We need support. And when we have those things, it shows us that we can make it through. We can make it through these moments of struggle, right? So I'm curious, for you, what are the moments that you see relationships in this Avatar verse where there are boundaries, there is consistency, there is support? Because I think if we find those spots, we might be able to find some hope as well.
I think the main ones, and this is probably going to be both a surprise and not a surprise, is through most of the romantic couples that we see in the Avatar verse. So Kyoshi and Rangi, like I mentioned previously, like Rangi sort of being Kyoshi's boundary setter. Like she knows Kyoshi's limits, even if Kyoshi doesn't know them at times, and is able to kind of help build that. I think is also the same for Asami and Korra. Like Asami knew exactly what Korra needed. She needed someone to be near for her. She needed someone who didn't, in a sense, talk down to her or focus on the things that she was in Korra's mind, quote unquote, failing at. And just be that someone to talk to and build that relationship with and know exactly what she wanted and needed. And just being that supportive presence. Like, obviously Asami was that person who was looking after Korra and like helping her get dressed, get ready for Janora's ceremony and all these sort of things. So we're seeing that, like, that sensitive, caring relationship between them, that even though Korra is a sense of deep hopelessness and powerlessness, Asami is there to be that person to support her as best as she can. And obviously Katara is the same with that for Aang. Like, when Aang is having those moments of where he is broken, she is the one who comes in to support him and look after him and kind of take him in and let him know it's okay to let these emotions out.
Yeah, no, those are all really great examples, and I'm being called to a few others as well. I think, you know, one of the things that I think is not always hope is this idea that, like, motivational speech, oh, everybody's inspired and hopeful now, right? And that's, like, I think of Imprisoned in Avatar: The Last Airbender, when Katara is like, I'm gonna save Haru because it's my fault that they're all there, and she's like, all right, y'all, and she gives this like really rousing, beautiful speech, and all of the Earthbenders are like, nope. And they're zero motivated by that, because they're in this profound sense of helplessness and hopelessness, and they're powerless to stop them because there's no Earth around, and so they don't feel capable. And then what I find really interesting is that she like coordinates this whole plan to get all the coal onto the top of the ship, gives them the tool they need, and still they're like, nope, I'm it's learned hopelessness, learned powerlessness. And then what she does is she continues to model what it looks like to stand up to the warden and these people. And eventually what happens is, because she's in relationship with Haru, and Haru doesn't want her to get hurt, and she's about to, he is also what I think is really important to note is he's the one who's been there the least amount of time, right? So this learned helplessness is not as applicable to him. And he fights back. And then only at that moment does everyone else see that they can also fight back. And so I think this really highlights the relationality of learned hope, right? Hope is learned. Hope is learned in the context of people. And I think that's what comes to mind when I think about that. What are your thoughts on that?
I can definitely see that. It's that sort of thing of like, I think it definitely also ties into the fact like it was clear that Katara wasn't quote unquote one of them. Like she obviously wasn't an earthbender. She brought these things in, and it was clear she couldn't use it herself. She wasn't someone who was going through the same things that they did. It took someone who was actually like them standing up for them to realize that they could do it.
Yes.
It's like it's not a great example, but this is the only thing coming to my head. It's like I've forgotten the name now. The Stonewall riot. So obviously yeah. So the first person who threw the brick was obviously from the community, which led to the community themselves banding together to do it, to kind of fight for their rights together. I think if it was someone who just happened to be a random straight person, it wouldn't have had the same level as effect, because they don't understand what the situation is. They won't face the same repercussions as the group that it is affecting. And I think it has that similar connotations. Like, that's why it didn't work straight away. It only worked when the person who was involved with that situation stepped up as well, and the rest followed.
Okay, so just to kind of summarize a little bit of what we've had a conversation around in terms of what we need to cultivate a resilient spirit, is hope happens when we have the ability to set realistic goals, when we're able to figure out and achieve those goals and be flexible and find different routes, when we believe in ourselves. So that's cultivating hope in that practice. Practicing critical awareness is when we're able to reality check and then letting go of numbing, right? And so just some questions that Brene offers in terms of how we reality check are literally, is this real or fantasy? Is this a fake picture, or is this a real picture? Is this doctored up, or is this as is raw footage? 2, does this reflect wholehearted living or turn us into objects or commodities? So when we see something or we're perceiving something, it's like, oh, this turned me into something yicky, or is this valuing me as a human? Then I think that's something that we should ask as well. And then 3, who benefits from my seeing this and feeling how this aims to make me feel? So when the warden says, I will treat you as well as you treat me, right? And then proceeds to like throw people off the ship and beat them and throw them into solitary confinement. We realize that, like, what is his goal and who benefits from maintaining civility here? It's him, right? Not the prisoners, right? And so I think often this rhetoric that people utilize is something that we need to question. Who benefits from me being asked to behave the way that this person is making me at, right?
Yeah.
So in terms of cultivating resilience, the final thing that I think is lifted up and spoken about is spirituality in the text. And what I want to do is I want to save that for another episode, because there's just so much wrapped into that. But what I will say is that Brene is very explicit in this text, saying that spirituality and resilience are inextricably connected. And one cannot be resilient without some sort of groundedness in the connectedness of others. And so I want to say it, but I also want to make sure that we give it enough time. And so we're going to save that for a future episode.
Awesome.
Did we miss anything in particular that we want to make sure that we hit other than that? Because that was on my list.
Not that I'm aware of. I think, other than that part, I think we hit the majority of the things that we wanted to cover in relation to, like, hopelessness and powerlessness, and how that can be solved through resilience and basically working on ways to keep hope and a sense of power within yourself. Awesome. And others as well.
For sure. All right, well, what we're going to do is we're going to come back in just a minute and discuss this lovely DIG acronym that Brene offers us. And we're going to dive into those 3 things, and then we'll set y'all off on your listening ears to listen to something else. So we're diving into this digging deep portion on the podcast now with these 3 things. D, get deliberate. I, get inspired. And G, get going. And so Brene offers this cool thing in the book called a vowel check, right? And it's from a 12-step process for, like, AA meetings. And it's called a vowel check. And so I just want to quickly go through these and then see if you have a different way of getting deliberate, or whether you use something like this. So A, have I been abstinent today? And again, abstinence is not like, it's not have I been abstinent in terms of, like, alcohol. It might be alcohol, but it might be something else as well. Like, however you define it. What is the thing that you're numbing with? And then have you been abstinent from that today? Have you been like letting go of that numbing reliance thing that you've been using? E, have I exercised today? I, have I done something for myself? O, what have I done for others today? U, am I holding on to unexpressed emotions today? And then Y is, yeah, what's something that happened? What is something good that happened today? I'm excited about this. Yay. So that's the vowel check, like getting deliberate, practicing that mindfulness around, being deliberate about how we're working and being mindful of our numbing and or powerlessness and or resilience. And so is there anything that you do, whether it's asking some of these questions or to be deliberate about this process?
I guess a thing that I do is this thing that I call, I don't really call it, it's just a general thing of like checking in. So I have a few friends who also struggle with like numbingness and kind of either doing too much or doing just kind of finding ways to kind of hide the issues that are going on. And so we do this check-in with each other on different chats. So each of us do it individually. So we're getting multiple checkups from different people. So we're feeling like there is someone there. We're feeling that there are people who care about the situation with us and are aware of our own feelings. But it's also a good moment as like a reminder. So like in my case, like I get a message from my friend Robert who say, have I taken time to rest? Have I hydrated yet? Have I had anything to eat yet? And questions like this. And I ask the same because they are just as bad about making sure they're staying hydrated and well, as we refer to it as watered and fed like plants, and kind of things like that. So I do this checking in thing with some friends and they do it in return, just so we're making sure that all of us are kind of doing better and making sure we're looking after ourselves.
So I'm hearing this like accountability buddy system, right?
Yeah.
That's helpful because I think that there are so many, like it's helpful to have multiple ways. Like what are the questions that we can be asking of ourselves and of each other in order to maintain awareness? Because in order to get deliberate, we have to be aware. And so that's the culture, like the cultivation thing is how do we cultivate awareness around that? And what I'm hearing from you is that you have people in your corner that are helping you, which is really helpful because you're also suggesting that like you were saying you struggle asking for help and maybe in some respect, but in this respect, it seems like you do that fairly well where you're able to lean on others and utilize that support. So that's really awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So that's getting deliberate, right? We want to become more aware of where we stand and then start to check those things. And so the next one, I, is getting inspired. And it's like, okay, what's going to motivate me? What's going to help lift me out of this like bleh feeling and get into more of how do I like, yes, I'm going to start taking these actions and I'm going to get going. Right. So, I'm curious, like like when you are in this mode of, I need support, right? And I need to become more aware of my body and myself to identify what that support is. Do you have something that motivates you that like really kind of inspires you to get that process started?
I guess it's kind of, I guess in relation to the inspired bit, it's that I have this love for creativity that when I am in that headspace of just feeling blur, my ability to be creative is lessened. I'll like force myself to do it, but I lose that enjoyment from it. So to be in a better headspace so I can still have that enjoyment of like writing my novels or my short stories and stuff like that. So it's finding ways to kind of be inspired to be better so I can be happier with what it is that I'm doing.
Yeah. It's interesting because the example that's provided in the book for this is the analogy of like stained glass. And it comes from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote that people are like stained glass windows. They like people sparkle and shine when the sun is out, but when the darkness sets in, like the stained glass is just stained glass. There's no light to make it beautiful. So it's only beautiful and it's only revealed if there is a light coming from within. And that kind of like implies that like with resilient people, like resilient people seem to be lit from within, and I want that, right? I want to be lit from within. That sounds like great. I don't want to rely, which is so counterintuitive, I don't want to rely on this external need for light. I want to have that light from within me, but in order to cultivate that, it's complicated because I need other people and I need that support, and I need to ask these people to help me be deliberate, right? I love making things complicated because that's life. And then get going, right? So once we've become aware, once we have the inspiration to act, what are the ways that we become actionable? And I'm hearing from you that it's becoming aware of my body, but also doing the things that helps me better. So like, not only is it becoming aware that, oh, I need water, it's like, okay, I need to drink that water, and I need to eat, and I need to rest, right? And so it's listening to your body and honoring what your body is saying. But I'm curious, what else? What else is helping you cultivate this resilience?
God, that's a good question. I guess it's just finding other things outside of being productive, I guess, is the thing. It's obviously for both of us being people who enjoy being busy, it's difficult to do something that isn't productive in a sense. So like going for a walk, I don't do that enough because I'm like, no, I need to keep being productive, which means I'm not getting enough exercise, I'm not getting enough fresh air, which admittedly I'm allergic to heat, so there are some times where I can't actually leave the house, so that's not always fun. But things like that, so finding ways to kind of make sure that I'm actually getting out to do things that isn't about being productive, and getting that into my routine.
I love that. Yeah, like actionable ways to practice this is really difficult, right? But it's also comes down to like, sometimes it's cultivating mindfulness in the sense of like, I'm going to make this a daily mantra or daily meditation that I'm thinking about, so that it's staying present in my mind. I'm going to intentionally, if you're a prayer person, maybe it's praying, since this is inherently connected to being spiritual, right? But whatever that is for us, whatever grounds us in connectedness, seems like a good place to get started. And so listeners, I invite you to think about, what are these steps for you, right? Because I'm definitely trying to do better, and I hope that we can all do better, so that we can all kind of embrace this concept of wholeheartedness a little bit more fully.
Definitely.
So next week we're discussing Guidepost 4, and this is a really intense one because it's cultivating gratitude and joy. But in order to do that, we have to let go of scarcity and fear of the dark, metaphorically speaking. And those will be, for those of you who are following along in the book, pages 101 through 112. And again, that's in the 10th anniversary edition, if not just the chapter on cultivating gratitude and joy. So Fran, this has been an incredible experience, and what an incredible conversation, and a long conversation. It went longer than I expected, but like, tell us about you. If people want to find you and engage with your work, how would you like them to do so?
Yeah, of course. So if anyone is listening, who is obviously, well, you will be a fan of Avatar, you are listening to this, you can check out my YouTube channel, A Healthy Dose of Fran. I'll be getting back to Avatar content at some point. I'm currently doing Percy Jackson content there, but you can check out all my past videos for Avatar content. Predominantly Legend of Korra focus, but have Avatar: The Last Airbender and Rise of Kyoshi theories. You can check out my Percy Jackson podcast if you are a fan of that. It is called The Best Damn Camp. It is on all podcast platforms, and you can follow the social media for that at Best Damn Camp Pod on Instagram and Twitter. I am also an author, so if you are interested in finding a new author to follow and see the budding career that I'm currently praying is hope it will work out, you can follow me at A Dose of Fran on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok.
Fabulous. All right, y'all, do us a favor and definitely go check that out. We would love for you to explore Fran's work. And again, you can also find us at Bending Not Breaking on Facebook, but we also have BNB_pod on all the various platforms, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, all the things. And I hope you'll come and check us out. We also have a Patreon that we lovingly appreciate when people join, and we have some fun content there as well, including conversations with me if you're interested on a higher tier, where we have monthly conversations about these guideposts in your context and relating it to Avatar. So check that out if you're curious. But no matter what, we hope you have a phenomenal grapple with this guidepost. So again, this is Bending Not Breaking. Fran, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
That was my pleasure. I want to thank you for sure. I want to thank Alex Mayfield, Max Gonguer, Noah Blanchard, and thearkofe for hosting this podcast. And this has been Bending Not Breaking. Until next time, be well and do.
Yeah.